We're thrilled to be presenting this webinar entitled Empowering Change, Helping Lawyers Combat Anti-Semitism in K-12 Communities. This panel is sponsored by the ABA Task Force on Combating Anti-Semitism. We are actively planning additional programming on a variety of issues, so please visit americanbar.org for updates on these programs. During today's program, we encourage you to ask questions of our panelists through the Q&A box, please, not the chat function, which has been disabled. If you don't see the controls, please know your screen is not idle. We will be monitoring the Q&A and will do our best to address your questions, time permitting. We will be sharing a recording of this program with everyone who is registered so that you can share it widely with your networks. We have a dynamic panel who will talk about the state of anti-Semitism in K-12 schools and learn how research and educational resources can help combat anti-Semitism. As professionals and thought leaders, your voice is indispensable in the fight against anti-Semitism and hate. We welcome the opportunity to share key learnings and tactics to use in support of educators and students to convey the importance of challenging anti-Semitism, allyship, and advocacy. My name is Bobbi Bittker. I am a civil rights policy attorney and town councilperson in Bedford, New York. I am a member of the ABA Task Force on Combating Anti-Semitism, chair of the Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Committee, and a member of the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice Council, and I will be moderating today's panel. First, I would like to introduce our speakers. Yonatan Belete is the Director of Strategy and Impact at the ADL Center for Anti-Semitism Research. Prior to joining the ADL, Yoni was a consultant at National Public Relations, Canada's leading communications firm, and previously served as Director of Speechwriting and Public Relations at the Embassy of Israel in Ottawa, where he advised two successive Israeli ambassadors to Canada. Originally from Toronto, Canada, Yoni holds a Bachelor of Arts with honors in Political Studies and History from Queen's University. During his studies, Yoni specialized in international relations with a research focus on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, the U.S.-Israel relationship, and Ethiopian ethnic federalism. Anyu Silverman is the program manager of Anti-Semitism, Holocaust and Genocide Education at the Anti-Defamation League. Anyu oversees ADL's Words to Action program for Jewish teens, among other programming. Prior to her time at the ADL, Anyu served as program officer at the Charles and Lynn Schusterman Family Philanthropies, where she ran recruitment, developed curricula, and facilitated for the Schusterman Fellowship. Anyu holds a master's in ethics, peace, and human rights from American University and a bachelor's degree in religious studies and Judaic studies from George Washington University. Sara Scheinbach is the Director of Education Advocacy at the ADL on the National Affairs team. In this role, she sets the strategy to combat anti-Semitism in K-12 schools through advocacy. Prior to this, Sara served as the Senior Associate Regional Director for the ADL, covering Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Western Pennsylvania. After earning her bachelor's degree from the University of Maryland, Sara began her career as a Teach for America Corps member, teaching kindergarten primarily to English language learners in Metro Atlanta. She earned her Juris Doctor from the Ohio State University Moritz College of Law and worked as a civil litigator for several years prior to joining the ADL. Thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to begin by asking Yoni, can you share with us how anti-Semitism has been showing up in K-12 schools and whether administrations have been responsive to those incidents?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the most important things to remember is that anti-Semitism was definitely an issue and a prevalent one prior to October 7th. However, since October 7th, we have seen an explosion in not only the number of anti-Semitic incidents that have come up in the United States, but also in the number of Americans that hold anti-Jewish trope endorsements. And so from an attitudinal perspective and also from an incidence perspective, we have seen an increase in anti-Semitism across the United States and also across the world. However, when we talk about, and we get into the presentation, we talk about some other details here, there are opportunities for optimism in how not only advocacy and education can help counter some of these anti-Jewish biases as well as prejudices. And while there's a lot of issues not only in the K-12 system, but also on campus, there is cause for optimism in what we as a community and as a whole of society approach can do to help counter those issues. But if we can get the PowerPoint slide put up, I could talk a little bit through some of those details as well. Great. Perfect. So, as mentioned, my name is Yonatan Belete, and I'm going to be speaking a little bit about anti-Semitism as an issue at a higher level, and then talk more about how it shows up in different groups, specifically among youth, an issue that we're all very concerned with right now, and how that, especially with K through 12, is a particularly interesting situation. Now, I want to talk a little bit about CAR for a moment, CAR being the Center for Anti-Semitism Research, which is one of the three centers at the Anti-Defamation League. It is the youngest of the three centers, established in January of 2022, and we are really here to help provide data-driven solutions to not only ADL's advocacy efforts, education, but also to our programs and how we counter anti-Semitism from both messaging perspective, government relations, and how the organization thinks about the issue. We are a team of PhD researchers, communications professionals, and we conduct both qualitative and quantitative research to really understand what are the predictive factors of anti-Semitism, what motivates it, and what are some of the reliable interventions that we can utilize to help reduce anti-Jewish trope endorsement in the United States, and overall, if it's at all possible, to help bring down the issue of anti-Semitism in general. Next slide, please. So what have we learned in the course of CAR's existence and its establishment? While there are a lot of definitions of anti-Semitism out there, some of the more popular ones endorsed by Jewish legacy institutions being the IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, from an empirical perspective, what CAR has understood anti-Semitism to be is a set of related conspiracy theories about collective Jewish power and malice that motivate prejudicial behavior and treatment. Now, I'm more than happy at the end of this webinar to take questions about that definition, where it comes from, but I really wanted to help provide this definition as a stage setter so that we understand and think about anti-Semitism as something that's broader and wider than just, let's say, anti-religious bigotry against an ethno-religious group, but something that's motivated by other factors, such as conspiratorial thinking. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned at the top, we have a real problem. In the United States, anti-Semitic incidents have seen an over 800% increase over the decades. We saw an explosion in the number of anti-Semitic incidents in 2023 and into 2024. And what we also have been able to find is on the graph on the right-hand side. Oh, I think we just lost it there. But on the graph on the right-hand side, you'll see that it's also an issue that's very much predictive of age. With younger American generations, particularly Gen Z and millennials, endorsing more anti-Jewish tropes than older generations. And so while we often thought of anti-Semitism as an issue going down over the previous decades, what we're seeing is that younger generations are endorsing more anti-Jewish tropes. Those tropes can be anything from Jews are insular or Jews attempt to only help each other, all the way to conspiratorial ones, which is around Jewish control over government and or financial systems. And so this is concerning because while we like to think things get better as generations go on and that tolerance and acceptance increases as generations go on, what we're seeing here is a reversal of that trend. And so it's extremely important that, that from an educational and advocacy perspective, that this research helps inform the kind of interventions that we at CAR advise in order to help make that reduction among communities and areas that are most indicative of having these anti-Jewish trope endorsements. Next slide, please. And so if we zoom out a little bit, in February 2024, CAR released its study on anti-Semitic attitudes in the United States, which identified that 24% of Americans embrace 6 or more anti-Jewish tropes or stereotypes, and that 85% of Americans embrace at least one anti-Jewish trope or stereotype. And that 3% of Americans agree with all 11 anti-Jewish tropes or stereotypes. The 11 coming from ADL's index, which helps us study the changes of attitudes that are endorsed. But overall, what we see is an increase from 2022 to 2024. And unfortunately, the trends are not heading in the right direction. Next slide, please. But as I mentioned at the top as well, there are opportunities to Bobby's question, which really opens up the door for this conversation. We know that there are certain interventions that can help reduce anti-Jewish trope endorsement. Holocaust education being one good example of that. In 2022, CAR conducted a study, and it helped us understand that respondents who correctly answered that 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust believed the fewest anti-Jewish tropes on average, being 3.2. But if you contrast that with those who believe that less than 1 million Jews were killed, the number of tropes that are endorsed jumps up to 7.3. What this really communicates to us at CAR and to the organization is that an understanding of not only Jewish identity, history, and Holocaust education really helps understand the level of anti-Jewish tropes that are endorsed. And so it's also important to understand that the respondents who indicated that their schools taught specifically about the Holocaust endorsed the fewest number of anti-Jewish tropes. So as we're in the midst of Holocaust International Remembrance Week, the day being on Monday, it's really important to understand that education around the Holocaust does help us understand the shifting nature of anti-Jewish trope endorsement, depending on whether or not people understand how the severity of the Holocaust and the number of Jews that were killed during that genocide. Next slide, please. And when we look at anti-Semitism in K-12 schools, CAR released a report in December of 2024 that helped us understand a lot more about the situation in the K-12 system. So overall, in 2023, CAR and ADL tracked over 1,000 incidents at non-Jewish K-12 schools, anti-Semitic incidents, that is, and that's a roughly 135% increase from 2022. This includes incidents, harassment, vandalism, assault, and overall, it was a situation that we see heading in the wrong direction. But what's extremely important that we found in this December 2024 study is that 71% of Jewish parents reported that their child encountered anti-Semitism in the classroom, and that 37% of non-Jewish parents said the same. And so we're seeing not only a high level of anti-Semitic incidents in the United States, we're not only seeing a high level of anti-Jewish trope endorsement, we're also seeing this reflected in the K-12 classroom. Next slide, please. But more of the good news. The good news is that a majority of Americans, of American parents and adults, do support K-12 Holocaust education, as well as K-12 anti-Semitism education. And so it's extremely important to remember that the implementation here is supported. However, there is a gap between the percentage of parents and adults in the United States that support education on the Holocaust and anti-Semitism and what is available. Only a fraction of current K-12 parents surveyed indicated that their child's school offered anti-Semitism education at 21% or Holocaust education at 30%. And among those parents, 86% support anti-Semitism education, as I mentioned, and 88% endorse Holocaust education. But notably, 52% of parents believe Holocaust education should be mandatory. So the main takeaway here is that despite this broad public backing, there is a significant gap in education offerings. And something that we at CAR and my colleagues do on a large part is trying to find areas of where we can bridge that gap. And I hope we can get into a little bit of that later. And on to the final slide. Now, I know we're here to talk about the K-12 system, but I want to also talk about the situation on campus. Students that graduate, many of them, some of them will end up on a college campus in the United States. And that's an issue and an area where we see the same level of severity. In November of 2023, CAR released a campus study report, which found that Jewish students are feeling less physically safe on university campuses, less emotionally safe, and they have a greater need or feel to hide their Jewish identity on their campuses, and they also engage in self-censorship regarding their views on Israel. Overall, 73% of Jewish college students have said that they've either witnessed or heard of an anti-Semitic incident on campus. And so these numbers are alarmingly high. They're unfortunately not trending in the right direction. And I think the importance of catching this situation and this issue at the K-12 system is hopefully to influence a change in the direction on campuses as well. But with that, I will hand it over to the next slide, where we'll dig in a little bit more with my colleagues on how to talk to young people about anti-Semitism.
Great, Yoni. Thank you so much. So I just want to remind our viewers, if you have any questions in response to what you have just learned or the topic in general, please just drop them in the Q&A box. So next, I would like to move on to Anyu and discuss, as it relates to educational resources for teachers and students, how does ADL Education aim to help? And what resources can our lawyers point to and share with their friends in the education sector?
Great question, Bobbi, and thank you all for having ADL join us today. Thank you folks for being here. So I'll get into the specifics in a little bit, but at a high level, ADL Education has created an combating or challenging anti-Semitism framework that's grounded in anti-bias principles and best practices that guides all of our resource development for students and K-12 educators. These resources aim to do one of two things. So ADL, as Yoni shared, tracks both anti-Semitic attitudes in the US and incidents, right? So what happens that leads up to an incident is people hold these anti-Semitic or biased attitudes about Jews and Jewish people. And then the reality or the manifestation of some of those attitudes are the incidents that Yoni just referred to, right? Harassment, vandalism, etc. So when thinking about what kinds of resources ADL Education provides, we predominantly seek to proactively interrupt anti-Semitism by bringing anti-Semitism education and Holocaust education into classrooms and youth group settings, and also to support educators by using professional development opportunities to do so. And the other piece is we also provide some incident response guides and tools in events of anti-Semitic incidents. So those are some of the ways in which we seek to interrupt anti-Semitism in the classroom, but I'll get into some specifics and share some specific resources shortly. I'm having trouble seeing Dennis's screen. I'm not sure if other folks are having the same issue. I see some, okay, great. I see this again. Fabulous. Well, thank you. Getting right into it, we can go to the next slide. How is ADL proactively interrupting anti-Semitism? The answer is education. So ADL Education's vision statement reads as follows: We envision a world where every individual and community is empowered with the knowledge, skills, and tools to challenge anti-Semitism and other forms of hate in order to champion justice for all. We've created frameworks, tools, and programs that help us achieve this vision. And as Yoni mentioned, all of this work is informed by research that Yoni and his team work tirelessly to conduct. So we can head to the next slide. Let's get down to brass tacks. How do we actually do it? How do we address the anti-Semitism that's affecting young people? We do so through professional development programs, courses and resources for K-12 educators, administrators, and support staff. And we do so through direct-to-student programming, courses, and resources. The other sort of core audience that we have continued to develop over time is supporting parents and caregivers through a variety of resources, webinars, et cetera. All of our offerings are free and accessible to folks who are interested. And again, I'll get into some specific resources a little bit later, but we'll be sharing our website as well if folks want to peruse. So we can go to the next slide. As I mentioned in response to Bobbi's question, I want to spend a minute on our challenging anti-Semitism framework, which is the approach that guides all of our anti-Semitism education work. Like all forms of bias and hate, anti-Semitism has unique features in history that require focused examination. And at the same time, and this framework applies transferable skills and mindsets that one can use to challenge all forms of bias. So the first step here is that we ground in Jewish identity, which helps students and adults alike understand the complexities of Jewish identity, its assets and nuances before diving into understanding anti-Semitism. We do this to allow learners to understand Jewish identity beyond the context of anti-Semitism, right? Beyond the form of bias or hate that impacts Jews most directly. And the purpose here is to recognize that Jews are a real, multidimensional people with a myriad of cultural, ethnic, religious practices and beliefs. And while Jewish identity isn't defined by anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism, of course, impacts Jewish identity. So we then dive into understanding what anti-Semitism is, how to identify it, understand manifestations and root causes. Then we start to build skills towards challenging anti-Semitism when it is safe to do so, online, interpersonally, in our communities, and perhaps most importantly, in ourselves. Finally, we make clear bridges between the skills that are gained throughout this framework and apply it to the universalisms of injustice. We help learners make connections between combating anti-Semitism and combating other forms of hate and bias. We can move on to the next slide. Anti-Semitism manifests in a plethora of different ways in a school context. You can see some of these manifestations here. I'm curious, I know that the chat is disabled, but would love for folks to reflect if any of these manifestations are surprising to you or what stands out to you. So I'll just read for accessibility's sake, hate, bullying, and anti-Semitism on social media, Holocaust-related jokes and body movements, swastikas and anti-Jewish graffiti, trivialization and denial of the Holocaust, anti-Semitic slurs and name-calling, anti-Semitic jokes, vandalism, attacks, and assault, anti-Semitic taunts, bullying, and harassment, and news stories that open pathways to anti-Semitism. So these are, again, just some of the ways in which anti-Semitism can manifest in a school context, in a community, and online. We can move on to the next slide, please. So what is the actual impact on young people? The impact is striking on young Jewish people and non-Jewish people. Students, young people in general, internalize anti-Semitic rhetoric and actions of their peers and communities. The very real impacts on young people are demonstrated here: physical, emotional, cognitive, behavioral, and academic. So let's dig in a little bit, in particular to the emotional indicators. For those of us who have meaningful, sustained relationships with young people, which I would say is likely most of us, in a parent-caregiver capacity, family member, trusted adult, volunteer in a school setting, any one of those, it's up to us to recognize when a young person in our life seems to be processing harm. So some indicators that we can look out for are as follows. When experiencing anti-Semitism or other forms of bias, it often manifests in young people behaving unpredictably. This is due to emotional dysregulation for many young people, and frankly, many of us adults as well. A lot of us don't have the training or ability to regulate emotionally in the aftermath of a harmful experience. So in an attempt to regulate, a young person's emotional responses to an anti-Semitic act may feel erratic to the outside observer. It might also be difficult for a young person to articulate how they're feeling, whether or not they're experiencing that dysregulation. So consider how you attune yourselves to the young people in your lives to notice that kind of shift. Lend a listening ear, extend additional compassion to that young person. The emotional dysregulation manifests in behavior change that's outlined here as well, right? Like clinging to someone or the trusted adults in their lives or their friends, or isolating, or showing up as a form of aggression. In physiological changes, like experiencing nightmares or fatigue or aches and pains in their bodies. In cognitive change, like difficulty concentrating in a one-on-one conversation or disorientation, not having a clear sense of their schedule. And also in academic change. The academic change might be most stark if an incident occurred in a school context, right? So a sudden aversion to going to school, grades dropping, etc. We can go to the next slide, please. So what do you do when you observe a young person in your life that's exhibiting some of these behaviors? I'm going to highlight a few of these that are broadly applicable to many of you who are in school volunteers, educators you may work or interact with in some way, shape, or form, and parents and caregivers. So the first I'll highlight is building resilience for your young people. So find ways to encourage asset orientations to your young people's identities, to honor and not criticize differences. So a young person's identities can be a well of resilience for them to ground in times of difficulty. The second is answer questions. Young people learn to be anxious or afraid of certain topics if they ask questions that are never or rarely appropriately addressed by adults. So if a young person in your life, for example, repeatedly asks about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the answer is repeatedly, it's too complicated, or we can talk about it when you're older, they'll stop asking, and they'll seek answers elsewhere, likely from a less reputable source, and view the topic as taboo to address with trusted adults. So that will automatically sort of turn the young people away and towards other, again, less reputable forms of information. It's also always okay to say that you don't know the answer, but that you will work with them to figure it out. The third is manage social media. The vast majority of young people today spend a significant time on social media. So offer tips to the young people in your lives on how to address biased incidents, when they see them online, that they can report posts, they can engage if it feels safe and productive for them to do so, or they can disengage entirely. The point here is to empower them with options and address the reality that the online space is not always safe. 4 is provide space for listening without judgment. Young people may be afraid or anxious to share their experiences of anti-Semitism with anyone, much less an authority figure in their lives or an adult. So practice compassionate, active listening and let them know that they're heard and cared for. 5, and this one I find to be most challenging, address a young person's needs without acting for them. So we can and should model what it looks like to address issues of hate and bias and help young people do so as well. And when a young person in your life approaches you after they've experienced or been the target of or witnessed a biased incident, we should spend less time telling them how to respond and more time listening to what they need, instead of assuming that we know best or acting on their behalf automatically. This approach helps teach students how to provide meaningful and appropriate help to their peers, right? To be a good listener, to listen for unspoken needs or wants. And it's also really healthy modeling for young people to show that you may not have all of the answers, but again, that you can work towards one together and provide, appropriate advice, of course. And lastly, take care of yourself. Receiving a young person's pain and hurt is not easy. So think about how you're building your own resiliency practices, spend time in community, and share ideas with other adults to support yourself in this work. So in thinking about your role as parents or caregivers, as lawyers who volunteer in school contexts, what can happen when students or young people feel connected to trusted adults? So the more students feel connected to school or these trusted adults, that's you and other students, those students begin using more ownership language at school, right? This is my school, I belong here, etc. Those students then begin to show up more in school spaces. They feel like school is a space they belong. And then those students begin to raise their hands more in class, especially classes where the educator who's worked with them most closely on these kinds of issues, or the volunteer that maybe folks in this audience have begun to build these kind of inclusive spaces that are open to deep listening. And these raised hands in class means that there are more questions asked and more conversations happening that engages more innate learning. And eventually there's grades that rise in class. Now, this is not like hyper-causal, right? There can be dips in this whole process. It's not one and done. Building safe and inclusive community for students, including Jewish students, is an ongoing endeavor. But these are some places that you can start to plug in. We can head to the next slide. So Bobbi, up top, you asked about resources. So I'm going to get into a few different resources and programs that ADL Education offers for educators and for students. So the first is a mini lesson called Antisemitism, What Do Educators Need to Know? We offer a mini lesson that is free, online, and self-paced for educators that's focused on how to understand anti-Semitism and combat it in school environments, from the classroom container, right? Like, what is the environment of the classroom, to building allyship among students, to making curricular choices. And this is a quick 20-minute long mini lesson that is self-paced. The next one is awareness to action, which, if we can move to the next slide, please. Awareness to Action is a 4-part digital learning opportunity for middle and high schoolers. So this is direct to student, that helps students understand Jewish identity and anti-Semitism. This interactive digital experience is administered through educators and follows ADL Education's Challenging Anti-Semitism framework, as all of our resources do. We can go to the next slide. And I'll drop some links in the chat once I am done sharing my piece. So to Yoni's point about the effectiveness of Holocaust education, for almost 20 years, Echoes and Reflections has been supporting educators through professional learning, providing resources, tools, and strategies to effectively deliver Holocaust instructions to students. Echoes and Reflections is an organization that is a partner organization between ADL, USC Shoah Foundation, and Yad Vashem. Echoes does this work really effectively through in-person facilitated programs, webinars, and online courses. Exciting and new to the Echoes portfolio are digital student activities. So they're self-paced learning activities that are designed for students to complete as a part of a classroom activity or an at-home assignment. And last but certainly not least, we have a million more resources, but don't want to bombard you here. We can head to the next slide. Is No Place for Hate. So No Place for Hate is a customizable program that serves as a container for schools to create inclusive environments. No Place for Hate looks different school to school based off of every school's needs, but the gist is that the program encourages student leadership, provides schools with a wide variety of activities to create healthy and safe environments for young people of all identities, and seeks to combat hate and bias. No Place for Hate also brings in anti-Semitism and Holocaust education in really key ways, but is a more holistic school culture program. So with that, I'm going to toss back to Bobbi and to Sara to share a little bit more about how you can advocate for the young people in your lives.
Anyu, thank you so much. Sara, can you address how we can leverage the research and the resources that have been shared? What advocacy efforts can we implement to help spread awareness about the need for anti-Semitism education requirements in the schools?
Yeah, thank you for the question. That's exactly what we're going to be talking about over the next few minutes here. So there is one resource that I want to share with all of you before we turn to my slides, and I will put this in the chat. It's adl.org/antisemitism-classroom. And you'll see on that website, we have broken down advocacy opportunities into 3 categories. Category 1 are opportunities for parents and caregivers. Opportunity 2 are for educators, and opportunity 3 are for administrators. So that's a really, really useful website. And I am going to share with you specifically what parents and caregivers can do in the next few minutes. The most important thing that you can do is to make your voice heard. As attorneys, you are all community leaders and your voice is powerful. So I am going to be sharing with you our 6 best practices to combat anti-Semitism that we are going to encourage all of you to advocate for at the K-12 level. So we can go to the slide presentation. All right, let's go to the first slide in this section. All right. So at ADL, we have launched the Ronald Birnbaum Center to Combat Anti-Semitism in Education. On this slide, you can see the 4 main goals for the center. So to provide a little bit more context about the center is that at the center, we provide the necessary tools to improve the safety and well-being of the Jewish members of our campus and school communities across the country, and to ensure that they are welcomed fully into these communities. We also ensure that there are consequences for inaction, and we leverage all available tools to ensure that educational institutions are meeting the moment. We actively disrupt and delegitimize anti-Semitic and anti-Israel groups that target K-12 schools and college campuses with a focus on dismantling their harmful influence. And finally, we deliver educational resources and advocacy programming to Jewish leaders and their allies, equipping them to effectively confront anti-Semitism in educational institutions. We can go to the next slide. So on this slide, there's a layout of all of the work that CCAE, that's our Center for Combating Anti-Semitism in Education, all of the work that CCAE does. We work very closely with our education department, and Anyu just shared a number of our resources that we put out with our education department. So we work very closely with them to develop resources, robust programming, and best practice guides for K-12 and higher education administrators and staff to help them address anti-Semitism and create inclusive environments. You got to hear from Yoni all about the work that our Center for Anti-Semitism Research does. We work very closely with CAR and other ADL centers on these cutting-edge studies that really inform our advocacy work. We ensure public awareness of the growing problem of anti-Semitism in the education space and the trends that drive it. We mobilize alumni, trustees, donors, parents, and really communities to advocate for education reforms that combat anti-Semitism and promote inclusive, respectful learning environments. We hold educational institutions accountable for their action or their inaction in addressing the problem. Some examples of that are we have a campus report card that you can Google the campus report card, and you can see that's for our universities and college campuses on anti-Semitism in those institutions. So that's just one example of that work. We work very closely with our Center on Extremism to track anti-Semitic incidents and extremist activities, both online and in person, to ensure quick action and greater transparency. We drive targeted advocacy campaigns that push for critical policy changes in school districts and universities while addressing anti-Semitism and bias in ethnic studies programs and other problematic curriculum that we see across the country. We offer support through ADL's Campus Anti-Semitism Legal Line, CALL, C-A-L-L for short, which has expanded in the K-12 space in 3 states, in New York, Massachusetts, and California. which provides legal resources to students and faculty, and it holds institutions accountable through tools like Title VI complaints. We also advocate through lobbying for stronger state and federal protections for Jewish students and educators, ensuring that governments respond effectively to the growing threat of anti-Semitism in educational institutions. So we can go to the next slide. So one of the ways that ADL is responding, well, 5 of the ways that ADL is responding are on this slide. And we're going to dig really deeply into the letter that we sent to 16,000 superintendents. So keep that in your mind. But we develop resources, guidance, and best practices for K-12 stakeholders, which I mentioned previously. We have parents and caregivers, educators, and administrators. We are working with superintendents all across the country on the 6 best practices to combat anti-Semitism in K-12 schools, which we're going to go into what those are in just a few minutes. I mentioned that we expanded our campus anti-Semitism legal line to K-12 in 3 states, which is unfortunate that we need to, but exciting that we were able to. Conduct research in collaboration with CAR, and we are currently analyzing state and federal laws to inform our advocacy strategy. We also educate parents with our resource hub, including common school incidents and how to respond to those incidents. All right, let's go to the next slide. All right, so I mentioned that we sent a letter to all 16,000 superintendents across the country, and we're going to focus on that letter by reviewing the 6 best practices that we recommend that school districts implement to combat anti-Semitism, and how you today can encourage your school district to combat anti-Semitism. So you see the first 2 of the 6 here. We are urging school districts across the country to use the IRA definition, the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. IRA stands for International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, when responding to reports of anti-Semitic harassment or discrimination in K-12 schools, and to assess the comprehensiveness of education programming that addresses anti-Semitism. We're also urging school districts to formally include anti-Semitism awareness education in all anti-bias and non-discrimination programming. We want them to incorporate it into the curriculum content focused on Jewish history and identity. We are encouraging all schools to adopt Holocaust and genocide curricula offerings, and provide mandatory anti-Semitism awareness and Holocaust education professional development trainings for all educators. We're also urging school districts across the country to adopt and/or expand their Holocaust and genocide curricular offerings to ensure that current and future generations understand the importance of confronting anti-Semitism and all forms of hate, and the dangers of remaining silent. And additionally, as I mentioned, we want school districts to incorporate Holocaust education into their professional development for their teachers and administrators. So their teachers and administrators, it's just as important for them to have a comprehensive understanding of the Holocaust and genocide in general and anti-Semitism as it is for the students. All right, we can go to the next slide. So you can see the next 2 of our 6 best practices here. With these 2, we are urging school districts to ensure that robust and comprehensive policies and protocols are in place and fully enforced, consistent with state and federal law, to effectively respond to anti-Semitic discrimination, harassment, and bullying in K-12 schools, and also to take steps to ensure full transparency regarding these policies. Schools have a responsibility to ensure that lesson plans are free from anti-Semitic bias toward Jews or the State of Israel, and that they don't unintentionally amplify or perpetrate anti-Semitic beliefs or attitudes in the school community. We're urging school districts to prevent all lessons on Israel, Judaism, the Jewish people, or the Holocaust from containing negative bias that either amplifies anti-Semitism or delegitimizes or demonizes the State of Israel. We can go to the next slide. Schools must issue clear and unwavering statements condemning anti-Semitism in the wake of anti-Semitic incidents, and they also must treat anti-Semitism with the same seriousness as other forms of hate. When a school district experiences an anti-Semitic incident, one of the most important steps that the district and school leadership can take is to call it out swiftly, clearly, and directly. We are urging schools and district leadership to speak out strongly and unequivocally in the wake of anti-Semitic incidents and to take appropriate remedial actions in response. We are also urging state education departments and school districts to review and or update their religious accommodation policies or guidelines to help foster equitable and inclusive learning environments for all students. So examples of that could be accommodating students who may miss school for a religious observance by providing students with an excused absence and a reasonable amount of time to make up any missed work. Another example is to encourage teachers, athletic directors, and other programmatic heads to avoid scheduling major events like tests or tryouts on religious holidays like the Jewish Sabbath and the Jewish high holidays. And we can go to the next slide. All right. We would like to open it up for questions. I will hand it back to Bobbi to moderate that portion.
Great, Sara. Thank you so much. So before we begin our question and answer session, I want to make you aware that we're going to be posting more links. There were a couple of questions about whether we're going to be sharing the slides. We are going to be sharing them with registrants after the program. So be sure to check for that. We have a lot of questions in the Q&A box, so we're going to be asking those. And I also have some other questions that I'd like to ask following the information that was shared by our panelists. So anybody can jump in on this. Have you seen situations where students are victims of anti-Semitism but are reluctant to report because of fear? And if so, how can we encourage them to report and ensure them that they're going to be protected?
I'm happy to take this one. So short answer is yes, we see this all the time. There's sort of two pieces to this. The first is what's happening before an incident occurs, right? How is a school creating an inclusive culture so that the student doesn't feel like there's going to, be fear of retribution should they report, that they have trust in the school administration or their teacher or their parent caregiver. So I would encourage folks to rely really heavily on the how a trusted adult can help slide that I talked about earlier, in sort of creating an environment in which hopefully that shouldn't come up. And the other piece is talking to the young people in your lives about the benefits of reporting. I certainly don't want to say all students have to report all incidents. We want to give students and young people the freedom of choice, right? Here are some benefits of what reporting could look like. Here's what might happen or might not happen if you choose not to report. So have those proactive conversations with the young people in your lives in order to even raise awareness that this is an option. Those are some initial tips. The other piece that I'll say is that the Association of Jewish Psychologists and the Jewish Community Mental Health Initiative have a bunch of additional resources about supporting Jewish young people and other students who may have experienced or witnessed anti-Semitism in a classroom context. So I would highly recommend folks take a look at some of their resources in order to start to have some of those conversations with the young people in your lives before an incident occurs.
Great, thank you. So by the time a lawyer is getting involved, an institution has refused to be held accountable for the anti-Semitism experienced by a student. Are there programs or safeguards that could be put in place to encourage more accountability on the part of these K through 12 institutions?
I want Sara to kick us off and then I'll chime in.
Yeah, thank you, Anyu. I think the most important thing for people on this call is to hold your own school districts accountable. So I mentioned that ADL, we have these best practices, and we strongly encourage that everyone on this call reach out to your principal, your superintendents, your school boards, anywhere you can make your voice heard, and let them know that you, as a community member, potentially as a parent or caregiver of a K through 12 student, that these best practices for combating anti-Semitism are important to you, and you can hold your schools accountable in that way.
Totally agreed with what Sara shared. Two other pieces of information. One is that we offer a live facilitated program for K-12 educators, school administrators, and staff called Educators Challenging Anti-Semitism, where we come into school contexts and have between an hour and 3 hour long training with the folks that work most closely with students about how to identify an anti-Semitic incident, how we define anti-Semitism, how they can uphold inclusive classrooms and school settings. So bringing in a program like this would be really helpful, again, in advance, a proactive option, or as a reactive option to say, okay, here's what went wrong in our school setting. How can we fix this for next time? And the other piece is that we offer an incident response guide for educators and school administrators to think through various stakeholders and action items that help, again, promote like safe and inclusive school environments after an incident has occurred. So I'll share those links in the chat momentarily.
Great, thank you. So Sara, you mentioned that the ADL, partnering with other legal entities, launched a legal helpline to provide pro bono legal assistance to parents of children who are experiencing anti-Semitism. It's active in New York, Massachusetts, California so far. Can you share how lawyers can get involved with this helpline if they want to donate their time?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. The best thing that you can do to get involved is to reach out to your local ADL office. If you are in California, Massachusetts, or New York, reach out to your local ADL office, let them know that you want to get involved, and they can put you in touch with the appropriate people internally to make that connection.
Okay, great, thank you. And how can parents advocate for Holocaust and anti-Semitism education if the school doesn't provide it yet? Because as we saw from Yoni's presentation, there seems to be widespread support for Holocaust and anti-Semitism education, but there's that disparity where we're seeing very little of it in practice. And if there's all this support, we need to advocate and do that, but how can we do that?
Yeah, so what I would recommend here is to, again, reach out to your principals, your superintendents, your school boards, let them know how important this is to you. And the data that Yoni shared is a really critical tool in our toolbox to show how high the demand is for these programs. And Anyu mentioned our partnership with Echoes and Reflections. Echoes and Reflections has on their website incredible lesson plans for teaching about the Holocaust and genocide in general. They also have a lesson, it's relatively new, about modern day anti-Semitism. So it really shouldn't be a super heavy lift for educators when these lesson plans are already created. So, that's something that folks on this call can do. If you're reaching out to the principals at the schools that you have connections with, you can share those resources with them. They're already made and they're excellent.
Great, thank you. So how can families fight anti-Semitism in the K through 12 institutions through legal means? What rights do parents have? And, what avenues do they have?
For that question, I would recommend sending an email to your regional office at ADL, and our legal experts can reach out and potentially talk to you about that. I know none of us on this call are serving as lawyers for ADL, so for that I would recommend reaching out to your ADL office.
And something that I also wanted to mention, I know that the New York, New Jersey region has a lawyers division where lawyers can volunteer, but where they also can share information with you about that. I don't know what the other regions throughout the country have, but I'm hoping that there are efforts where people can also get involved as lawyers, but they will definitely be able to have legal advisors to tell people how they can actually use the law to help them advocate for their children when they're dealing with these problems. We've got another question. In your experience, how responsive are school administrators when anti-Semitism that's experienced by the student happens on social media outside of school hours by a fellow student?
It's such a great question, and I hate to say it depends, but it depends, which I feel like to a group of lawyers is an appropriate response. It really just depends on the school administrator's approach to how they define school community and school culture. So one of the ways that you can proactively relationship build with school administrators to make sure that should an incident like this occur with your young person or a young person in your life, is to proactively have these conversations with school administrators, with the principal, et cetera, to see what kind of responses they have given historically when there's a social media related incident. Typically, if a social media related incident sort of bleeds into a classroom setting where there becomes sort of an altercation of sorts, that is almost always dealt with in a school admin capacity, but it really does depend on the view and outlook of your school administrator. So again, would encourage a proactive conversation with the school folks in your life. And Yoni, I see that you unmuted too.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add to that response on you that in November of 2023, CAR conducted a longitudinal study on anti-Semitism on U.S. college campuses. And, we found that a majority of all students, Jewish and non-Jewish, do feel like their campus administrators have not done enough to address anti-Jewish prejudice on their university campuses, with 70% of students saying their university should do more to address the issue. And so while that percentage is not indicative of like on campus versus online, I think it does communicate a representative and general assertion that a lot of students feel as though campus administrators can and should be doing more to address the issue. And it's not only one that's impacting Jewish students, it's impacting non-Jewish students as well, whether or not they're mistaken for being Jewish or it's harming their campus environment. I think administrators are important conduits to helping solve this issue, and we should be working with them very closely in order to support students on campus, Jewish and non-Jewish alike.
Great, thank you. We have a question. I think it was in response to something that Anyu might have said. I'm not sure. But the question is, news stories opening paths to anti-Semitism is a new example for me. Can you share examples of this, please? The commenter says media has historically played a dangerous role in promoting narratives which dehumanize and otherize communities, especially marginalized communities of color. So the question is about news stories that open paths to anti-Semitism.
Yeah, really appreciate that question. And I think the answer is largely in that last piece, right? That when media distorts an actor in a news story. For example, if there's a conflation in a news story between the actions of the Israeli military and all Jews, which does happen with some frequency, unfortunately, as it does happen for other communities, that can lead to anti-Semitic rhetoric and action in schools when young people repeat what they hear in the news, whether or not that information is accurate or discerning. So that's sort of what that manifestation was referring to. And one of the really beautiful ways that I know that Yoni and his team work a lot on to combat this issue is through digital and media literacy. Thinking really critically about how to, again, talk to your young people about how to analyze what they're seeing in the news and what they're hearing from other folks in their lives, what they're consuming on social media, et cetera, to really beef up those critical thinking skills and not make broad sweeping assumptions based off of a news headline. I want to toss to Yoni because I know that you have a lot of additional resources and thoughts on digital literacy and media literacy.
Yeah, Carr has one of the main predictive factors of anti-Semitism that Carr has identified is conspiratorial thinking. And so if we think about ways in which we can help attenuate such form of thinking, digital literacy is a really important component in that. And so one of the elements that we have at CAR in terms of our research agenda is identifying reliable interventions that could reduce anti-Jewish trope endorsement. And if we can help young people be more, let's say, like digitally literate, be able to think critically. A lot of these tools and lessons hopefully are infused at a younger age and through education, but we see that as a step towards thinking more critically about various issues. And so hopefully we can use those kinds of research models that have showed that digital literacy does indeed help reduce conspiratorial thinking, and that in turn that could help reduce anti-Jewish trope endorsement among American adults. Obviously, this intervention and testing is something that CAR does rigorously, and we work on it all the time. And we hope to have like a portfolio of interventions that we could help affix to either advocacy or educational campaigns so that there's a data-driven approach to the solutions that we're offering.
So Yoni, I know that we shared a link with somebody who had asked earlier, but can you identify what the 11 tropes are that were used in that research? Because people were very curious about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I could pull it up real quickly on the link, but I do want to confirm. I don't have them all memorized, but I do want to confirm that to some of the questions that people had around the difference between anti-Jewish and anti-Israel. So I do want to make clear that CAR does differentiate anti-Jewish tropes from anti-Israel bias or anti-Israel policy positions. Those are not infused in the 11. And in the 11 that I cited, they're very specific to prejudices and or stereotypes that, as I mentioned, revolve around some three main categories. Them being number one, the nature of Jewish communities. So, for example, one of them being Jews are insular, Jews only support each other in business. The second one is around Jewish control or conspiracies, such as Jews control the banks or Jews control the American government. So while I don't have all of the 11 in front of me, the link there will send you directly to them, and that is how we study anti-Jewish trope endorsement in the United States. But I do want to really specify that none of the 11 tropes engage in asking questions of respondents on their positions on Israel.
Okay, thank you. We have a question. Can you contrast the two definitions of anti-Semitism that were mentioned?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm glad someone was listening to the differences in those two definitions. So let me speak to the definition I provided. So at CAR, as I mentioned, a team of PhD researchers are very interested in understanding the difference between normative and empirical definitions. And when we think about anti-Semitism at CAR, we're thinking about it from an empirical perspective. So what are some of the findings that we are seeing in the number of anti-Jewish trope endorsements that can help explain what anti-Semitism is from an empirical perspective? And that's how we come with the definition of anti-Semitism being a set of related conspiracy theories that motivate prejudicial behavior and or treatment towards Jewish people. Now, that is not a definition from a normative perspective, which is the one that Sara was able to provide, which is an IRA definition. But for us at CAR, we use this definition to help understand what anti-Semitism looks like from an empirical perspective, and B, what are the predictive factors that the research is pointing towards. And so we at CAR kind of make that differentiation. But again, it's not to put the two definitions at loggerheads or to say that one supersedes the other. It's to understand the difference between normative and empirical, as opposed to saying one definition being better than the other.
I'll chime in a little bit here and say this. We actually use multiple definitions of anti-Semitism at ADL, in case you couldn't tell. I think Sara, myself, and Yoni probably use 3 different definitions with a lot of frequency. And I want us to ask the question about whether a definition is the end or a means to an end. So I often use a more similar definition to Sara, but also a little bit different, not verbatim the IRA definition, because I'm most frequently talking to young people and educators. So the purpose is to create shared understanding of what anti-Semitism is and looks like and manifests as. So that language that I use tends to be different than the definition that Yoni and his team at CAR uses, which would require an immense amount of pre-knowledge to be able to get to that point of definition. It's also different from the definition that Sara uses, which is more of an enforcement definition, which is particularly helpful in an advocacy setting when thinking about, right, how to enforce rules, norms, understandings in response to anti-Semitic incidents or attitudes. So again, different purposes here, mine being education, Sara's being advocacy and enforcement, and Yoni's being research. Yeah, I'll close there.
Great, thank you. So one of the struggles that we've noticed is that beyond definitions, which I think people get very mired in, is that people actually have difficulty recognizing anti-Semitism when they see it. And it complicates reporting the incidences, which is why we believe that there are actually more incidences and crimes than they're actually reported. So can you give some examples of anti-Semitic incidences that have been reported in K-12 institutions, and perhaps some that you think should be reported but have been overlooked?
Yeah, I can start with that. So I think I mentioned a bit at the top about how we saw a 135% increase from 2022 to 2023 in those incidents, and they include everything from harassment to vandalism and assault. There were 156 incidents at non-Jewish K-12 schools that were related to, let's say, Israel or Zionism related, and there were 558 incidents at non-Jewish K-12 schools that included a swastika symbol. And so we bucketed between incidents, harassments, vandalism, and assault. But those are some of the ways in which anti-Semitic incidents pop up at K-12 schools.
I would just go back to the slide that I shared earlier around manifestations in schools, right? So Holocaust-related jokes and hand gestures, and this often happens after students learn about the Holocaust for the first time. There's this like not a lack of understanding, I think, initially for a lot of students, especially in middle school, who lack some of the maturity to be able to process sort of the gravity of the information they're receiving. And there often is an uptick in Holocaust jokes in school settings, for example. There are a number of incidents of like anti-Semitic jokes that are not reported. I won't say whether or not like these must be or should be reported more frequently, but it is something that happens all the time in school settings. That if not addressed by an educator or a school administrator can fester into more significant anti-Semitic incidents, etc. And the other thing to note is just that there are many instances in which anti-Semitic incidents in school settings are just categorized as general bullying or perceived as general bullying, which means that they don't get reported to ADL or sometimes don't get reported in the same way to school administration. Just a thing to note.
And I will just add that the definition that we're encouraging school districts to adopt, the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, it lays out a number of examples of what contemporary anti-Semitism can look like. So I'll go ahead and put a link in the chat to the IRA definition of anti-Semitism that also can give some helpful examples of the way that it manifests everywhere, including K-12 settings.
Great, thank you. So that's a good segue to this next question. Now, Pew Research did a recent study that showed that close to 90% of people who identify as Jewish also feel that they identify some connection with Zionism as part of their Jewish identity. So they are intricately related and inseparable. So that lends itself to the idea that so many instances of anti-Israel hate are related to anti-Semitism. However, often legitimate criticism of Israel's policies are often mistaken for anti-Semitism. Can you talk about thoughts on that?
Yeah, happy to. So there is a very, and I hope to make this clear, there is a very clear distinction between criticism of policies of the Israeli government and calls for either the eradication or elimination of the state of Israel, with the former being what we would consider a form of anti-Semitism. Sorry, with the latter being a form of anti-Semitism, and the former not being. So criticizing the policies of the Israeli government, whether that be the military campaign in Gaza, whether that be a specific policy, whether that's foreign, whether it's foreign or domestic, is not anti-Semitism. And there are many Jewish Americans and Jews in the diaspora across the political spectrum that hold varying opinions on Israeli state policies, varying from extremely negative and not supportive of, all the way to very supportive. Where the line often is crossed is when either the legitimacy of the state of Israel is being brought into question and or advocacy for its elimination. It's also really important, as you had mentioned, that for an overwhelming majority of American Jews, caring for and being interested in and being invested in the Jewish state and in its future is an extremely important component of Jewish identity for many people. But that is not to make the argument that criticizing that country is therefore anti-Semitic. It's to make the argument that because of the religious, historical, and familiar connection that a majority of Jewish people have to Israel, therefore, there is an intrinsic link that many Jewish people identify with Israel. And therefore, it is part and parcel of what it means to be Jewish for many people. That is very different than to say that criticizing the country or its policies is anti-Semitic, which it is not. And so that distinction is one that we make internally, and it's one that is made very forcefully in a variety of different definitions. Where it crosses into anti-Semitism is calls for the elimination of the state of Israel and thereby the harming its both Jewish and non-Jewish citizens.
Thanks, Yoni. I'll just add that what we say at ADL is that if criticizing the Israeli government were anti-Semitic, then most Israelis would be anti-Semitic. So the same way that in America, we are free to have opinions about our own government, we are free to have opinions about governments all over the world. And I'm going to share a resource in the chat from Echoes and Reflections that lays out what Yoni was just talking about, that line of when criticism crosses into anti-Semitism. It's this test called the 3Ds test. The Ds stand for demonization, double standards, and delegitimization. So we say that when criticism of Israel crosses the line into anti-Semitism are if one of those 3Ds are present. So just to give quick examples, demonization of Israel would be things like equating Israel with Nazis, or saying that Israel is the sole source of evil. So the demonization there. The next D is double standards. So when criticism of Israel is applied selectively in a grossly unfair manner, and Israel is singled out, but other countries who may be doing similar things are not called out at all. So when Israel has that double standard applied against it, that's when we say it crosses the line. And then also delegitimization, and Yoni mentioned this. So when Israel's fundamental right to exist is denied, that also is what we consider anti-Semitism. So I will put that link in the chat.
Great, thank you. I appreciate you making those distinctions. This is something that comes up extremely often, and even more so since October 7th. I think that was actually a lot of questions. Let me see if there are any more. Yeah, we addressed a lot of questions. Great, thank you so much for all that time you spent. I want to thank everyone for joining us for this free webinar, and I want to thank our panelists for taking the time to share your expertise with us, as well as the critical work that you're doing. The Task Force on Combating Anti-Semitism provides free webinars and resources for legal professionals and advocates nationwide. We hope this helps you in your work, and if you can, please consider joining and becoming active in the ABA. You may do so at americanbar.org. Best of luck in your work, and thank you again for taking the time to join us.